Modern Prophecies by Charles Mackay. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Modern Prophecies Part 1. An epidemic terror of the end of the world has several times spread over the nations. The most remarkable was that which seized Christendom about the middle of the 10th century. Numbers of fanatics appeared in France, Germany, and Italy at that time, preaching that the 1,000 years prophesied in the Apocalypse as the term of the world's duration were about to expire, and that the Son of Man would appear in the clouds to judge the godly and the ungodly. The delusion appears to have been discouraged by the Church, but it nevertheless spread rapidly among the people. The scene of the Last Judgment was expected to be at Jerusalem. In the year 999, the number of pilgrims proceeding eastward to await the coming of the Lord in that city was so great that they were compared to a desolating army. Most of them sold their goods and possessions before they quitted Europe, and lived upon the proceeds in the Holy Land. Buildings of every sort were suffered to fall into ruins. It was thought useless to repair them when the end of the world was so near. Many noble edifices were deliberately pulled down. Even churches, usually so well maintained, shared the general neglect. Knights, citizens, and serfs travelled eastwards in company, taking with them their wives and children, singing psalms as they went, and looking with tearful eyes upon the sky, which they expected each minute to open, to let the Son of God descend in his glory. During the 1000th year the number of pilgrims increased. Most of them were smitten with terror as with a plague. Every phenomenon of nature filled them with alarm. A thunderstorm sent them all upon their knees in mid-March. It was the opinion that thunder was the voice of God, announcing the day of judgment. Numbers expected the earth to open and give up its dead at the sound. Every meteor in the sky seen at Jerusalem brought the whole Christian population into the streets to weep and pray. The pilgrims on the road were in the same alarm. Quote, Lorsque, pendant la nuit, un globe de lumière s'échappa quelquefois de la voûte de cieux et traça dans sa chute un long sillon de feu, la troupe suspendit sa marche solitaire. Footnote, Charlemagne, poème épique, par Lucien Bonaparte. Fanatic preachers kept up the flame of terror. Every shooting star furnished occasion for a sermon, in which the sublimity of the approaching judgment was the principal topic. The appearance of comets has been often thought to foretell the speedy dissolution of this world. Part of this belief still exists, but the comet is no longer looked upon as the sign, but the agent of destruction. So lately as in the year 1832, the greatest alarm spread over the continent of Europe, especially in Germany, lest the comet, whose appearance was then foretold by astronomers, should destroy the earth. The danger of our globe was gravely discussed. Many persons refrained from undertaking or concluding any business during that year, in consequence solely of their apprehension that this terrible comet would dash us and our world to atoms. During seasons of great pestilence, men have often believed the prophecies of crazed fanatics, that the end of the world was come. Credulity is always greatest in times of calamity. During the Great Plague, which ravaged all Europe between the years 1345 and 1350, it was generally considered that the end of the world was at hand. Pretended prophets were to be found in all the principal cities of Germany, France, and Italy, predicting that within 10 years the trump of the archangel would sound, and the Saviour appear in the clouds to call the earth to judgment. No little consternation was created in London in 1736 by the prophecy of the famous Whiston, that the world would be destroyed in that year, on the 13th of October. Crowds of people went out on the appointed day to Islington, Hampstead, and the fields intervening, to see the destruction of London, which was to be the beginning of the end. A satirical account of this folly is given in Swift's Miscellanies, Volume 3, entitled A True and Faithful Narrative of What Passed in London on a Rumour of the Day of Judgment. An authentic narrative of this delusion would be interesting, but this solemn witticism of Pope and Gay is not to be depended upon. In the year 1761, the citizens of London were alarmed by 2 shocks of an earthquake, and the prophecy of a third, which was to destroy them altogether. The first shock was felt on the 8th of February, and threw down several chimneys in the neighbourhood of Limehouse and Poplar. The second happened on the 8th of March, and was chiefly felt in the north of London, and towards Hampstead and Highgate. It soon became the subject of general remark that there was exactly an interval of a month between the shocks, and a crack-brained fellow named Bell, a soldier in the Life Guards, was so impressed with the idea that there would be a third in another month, that he lost his senses altogether, and ran about the streets predicting the destruction of London on the 5th of April. Most people thought that the 1st would have been a more appropriate day, but there were not wanting thousands who confidently believed the prediction, and took measures to transport themselves and families from the scene of the impending calamity. As the awful day approached, the excitement became intense, and great numbers of credulous people resorted to all the villages within a circuit of 20 miles, awaiting the doom of London. Islington, Highgate, Hampstead, Harrow, and Blackheath were crowded with panic-stricken fugitives, who paid exorbitant prices for accommodation to the housekeepers of these secure retreats. Such as could not afford to pay for lodgings at any of those places remained in London until 2 or 3 days before the time, and then encamped in the surrounding fields, awaiting the tremendous shock which was to lay their high city all level with the dust. As happened during a similar panic in the time of Henry VIII, the fear became contagious, and hundreds who had laughed at the prediction a week before packed up their goods when they saw others doing so, and hastened away. The river was thought to be a place of great security, and all the merchant vessels in the port were filled with people, who passed the night between the 4th and the 5th on board, expecting every instant to see St. Paul's totter, and the towers of Westminster Abbey rock in the wind and fall amid a cloud of dust. The greater part of the fugitives returned on the following day, convinced that the prophet was a false one, but many judged it more prudent to allow a week to elapse before they trusted their dear limbs in London. Bell lost all credit in a short time, and was looked upon even by the most credulous as a mere madman. He tried some other prophecies, but nobody was deceived by them, and in a few months afterwards he was confined in a lunatic asylum. A panic terror of the end of the world seized the good people of Leeds and its neighbourhood in the year 1806. It arose from the following circumstances. A hen in a village close by laid eggs, on which were inscribed the words, "Christ is coming." Great numbers visited the spot and examined these wondrous eggs, convinced that the day of judgment was near at hand. Like sailors in a storm, expecting every instant to go to the bottom, the believers suddenly became religious, prayed violently, and flattered themselves that they repented them of their evil courses. But a plain tale soon put them down, and quenched their religion entirely. Some gentlemen, hearing of the matter, went one fine morning and caught the poor hen in the act of laying one of her miraculous eggs. They soon ascertained beyond doubt that the egg had been inscribed with some corrosive ink, and cruelly forced up again into the bird's body. At this explanation those who had prayed now laughed, and the world wagged as merrily as of yore. At the time of the plague in Milan, in 1630, of which so affecting a description has been left us by Ripamonte in his interesting work De Peste Mediolani, the people, in their distress, listened with avidity to the predictions of astrologers and other impostors. It is singular enough that the plague was foretold a year before it broke out. A large comet appearing in 1628, the opinions of astrologers were divided with regard to it. Some insisted that it was a forerunner of a bloody war. Others maintained that it predicted a great famine, but the greater number, founding their judgment upon its pale colour, thought it portended a pestilence. The fulfilment of their prediction brought them into great repute while the plague was raging. Other prophecies were current, which were asserted to have been delivered hundreds of years previously. They had a most pernicious effect upon the mind of the vulgar, as they induced a belief in fatalism. By taking away the hope of recovery, that greatest balm in every malady, they increased threefold the ravages of the disease. One singular prediction almost drove the unhappy people mad. An ancient couplet, preserved for ages by tradition, foretold that in the year 1630 the devil would poison all Milan. Early one morning in April, and before the pestilence had reached its height, The passengers were surprised to see that all the doors in the principal streets of the city were marked with a curious daub or spot, as if a sponge, filled with the purulent matter of the plague sores, had been pressed against them. The whole population were speedily in movement to remark the strange appearance, and the greatest alarm spread rapidly. Every means was taken to discover the perpetrators, but in vain. At last the ancient prophecy was remembered, and prayers were offered up in all the churches, that the machinations of the evil one might be defeated. Many persons were of opinion that the emissaries of foreign powers were employed to spread infectious poison over the city, but by far the greater number were convinced that the powers of hell had conspired against them, and that the infection was spread by supernatural agencies. In the meantime the plague increased fearfully. Distrust and alarm took possession of every mind. Everything was believed to have been poisoned by the devil: the waters of the wells, the standing corn in the fields, and the fruit upon the trees. It was believed that all objects of touch were poisoned: the walls of the houses, the pavements of the streets, and the very handles of the doors. The populace were raised to a pitch of ungovernable fury. A strict watch was kept for the devil's emissaries, and any man who wanted to be rid of an enemy had only to say that he had seen him besmearing a door with ointment. His fate was certain death at the hands of the mob. An old man, upwards of 80 years of age, a daily frequenter of the church of St. Antonio, was seen, on rising from his knees, to wipe with the skirt of his cloak the stool on which he was about to sit down. A cry was raised immediately that he was besmearing the seat with poison. A mob of women, by whom the church was crowded, seized hold of the feeble old man and dragged him out by the hair of his head, with horrid oaths and imprecations. He was trailed in this manner through the mire to the house of the municipal judge, that he might be put to the rack and forced to discover his accomplices, but he expired on the way. Many other victims were sacrificed to the popular fury. One Mora, who appears to have been half a chemist and half a barber, was accused of being in league with the devil to poison Milan. His house was surrounded, and a number of chemical preparations were found. The poor man asserted that they were intended as preservatives against infection, but some physicians, to whom they were submitted, declared they were poison. Mora was put to the rack, where he for a long time asserted his innocence. He confessed at last, when his courage was worn down by torture, that he was in league with the devil and foreign powers to poison the whole city, that he had anointed the doors and infected the fountains of water. He named several persons as his accomplices, who were apprehended and put to a similar torture. They were all found guilty and executed. Mora's house was razed to the ground, and a column erected on the spot, with an inscription to commemorate his guilt. While the public mind was filled with these marvelous occurrences, the plague continued to increase. The crowds that were brought together to witness the executions spread the infection among one another. But the fury of their passions and the extent of their credulity kept pace with the violence of the plague. Every wonderful and preposterous story was believed. One, in particular, occupied them to the exclusion for a long time of every other. The devil himself had been seen. He had taken a house in Milan, in which he prepared his poisonous unguents, and furnished them to his emissaries for distribution. One man had brooded over such tales till he became firmly convinced that the wild nights of his own fancy were realities. He stationed himself in the market-place of Milan, and related the following story to the crowds that gathered round him. He was standing, he said, at the door of the cathedral late in the evening, and when there was nobody nigh, he saw a dark-coloured chariot, drawn by 6 milk-white horses, stop close beside him. The chariot was followed by a numerous train of domestics in dark liveries, mounted on dark-coloured steeds. In the chariot there sat a tall stranger of a majestic aspect. His long black hair floated in the wind, fire flashed from his large black eyes, and a curl of ineffable scorn dwelt upon his lips. The look of the stranger was so sublime that he was awed, and trembled with fear when he gazed upon him. His complexion was much darker than that of any man he had ever seen, and the atmosphere around him was hot and suffocating. He perceived immediately that he was a being of another world. The stranger, seeing his trepidation, asked him blandly, yet majestically, to mount beside him. He had no power to refuse, and before he was well aware that he had moved, he found himself in the chariot. Onwards they went, with the rapidity of the wind, the stranger speaking no word, until they stopped before a door in the high street of Milan. There was a crowd of people in the street, but, to his great surprise, no one seemed to notice the extraordinary equipage and its numerous train. From this he concluded that they were invisible. The house at which they stopped appeared to be a shop, but the interior was like a vast half-ruined palace. He went with his mysterious guide through several large and dimly lighted rooms. In one of them, surrounded by huge pillars of marble, a senate of ghosts was assembled, debating on the progress of the plague. Other parts of the building were enveloped in the thickest darkness, illumined at intervals by flashes of lightning, which allowed him to distinguish a number of gibing and chattering skeletons running about and pursuing each other, or playing at leapfrog over one another's backs. At the rear of the mansion was a wild, uncultivated plot of ground, in the midst of which arose a black rock. Down its sides rushed with fearful noise a torrent of poisonous water, which, insinuating itself through the soil, penetrated to all the springs of the city, and rendered them unfit for use. After he had been shown all this, the stranger led him into another large chamber, filled with gold and precious stones, all of which he offered him if he would kneel down and worship him, and consent to smear the doors and houses of Milan with a pestiferous salve which he held out to him. He now knew him to be the devil, and in that moment of temptation prayed to God to give him strength to resist. His prayer was heard. He refused the bribe. The stranger scowled horribly upon him. A loud clap of thunder burst over his head. The vivid lightning flashed in his eyes, and the next moment he found himself standing alone at the porch of the cathedral. He repeated this strange tale day after day, without any variation, and all the populace were firm believers in its truth. Repeated search was made to discover the mysterious house, but all in vain. The man pointed out several as resembling it, which were searched by the police, but the demon of the pestilence was not to be found, nor the hall of ghosts, nor the poisonous fountain. But the minds of the people were so impressed with the idea that scores of witnesses, half crazed by disease, came forward to swear that they also had seen the diabolical stranger and had heard his chariot, drawn by the milk-white steeds, rumbling over the streets at midnight with a sound louder than thunder. The number of persons who confessed that they were employed by the devil to distribute poison is almost incredible. An epidemic frenzy was abroad, which seemed to be as contagious as the plague. Imagination was as disordered as the body, and day after day persons came voluntarily forward to accuse themselves. They generally had the marks of disease upon them, and some died in the act of confession. During the Great Plague of London in 1665, the people listened with similar avidity to the predictions of quacks and fanatics. Defoe says that at that time the people were more addicted to prophecies and astronomical conjurations, dreams and old wives' tales than ever they were before or since. Almanacs and their predictions frightened them terribly. Even the year before the plague broke out, they were greatly alarmed by the comet which then appeared, and anticipated that famine, pestilence, or fire would follow. Enthusiasts, while yet the disease had made but little progress, ran about the streets, predicting that in a few days London would be destroyed. A still more singular instance of their faith in predictions occurred in London in the year 1524. The city swarmed at that time with fortune-tellers and astrologers, who were consulted daily by people of every class in society on the secrets of futurity. As early as the month of June 1523, several of them concurred in predicting that, on the first day of February 1524, the waters of the Thames would swell to such a height as to overflow the whole city of London, and wash away 10,000 houses. The prophecy met implicit belief. It was reiterated with the utmost confidence month after month, until so much alarm was excited that many families packed up their goods and removed into Kent and Essex. As the time drew nigh, the number of these emigrants increased. In January, droves of workmen might be seen, followed by their wives and children, trudging on foot to the villages within 15 or 20 miles to await the catastrophe. People of a higher class were also to be seen in wagons and other vehicles bound on a similar errand. By the middle of January at least 20,000 persons had quitted the doomed city, leaving nothing but the bare walls of their homes to be swept away by the impending floods. Many of the richer sort took up their abode on the heights of Highgate, Hampstead, and Blackheath, and some erected tents as far away as Waltham Abbey on the north, and Croydon on the south of the Thames. Bolton, the prior of St. Bartholomew's, was so alarmed that he erected, at a very great expense, a sort of fortress at Harrow on the Hill, which he stocked with provisions for 2 months. On the 24th of January, a week before the awful day which was to see the destruction of London, he removed thither, with the brethren and officers of the priory and all his household. A number of boats were conveyed in waggons to his fortress, furnished abundantly with expert rowers, in case the flood, reaching so high as Harrow, should force them to go farther for a resting place. Many wealthy citizens prayed to share his retreat, but the prior, with a prudent forethought, admitted only his personal friends and those who brought stores of eatables for the blockade. At last the morn, big with the fate of London, appeared in the east. The wondering crowds were astir at an early hour to watch the rising of the waters. The inundation, it was predicted, would be gradual, not sudden, so that they expected to have plenty of time to escape as soon as they saw the bosom of old Thames heave beyond the usual mark. But the majority were too much alarmed to trust to this, and thought themselves safer 10 or 20 miles off. The Thames, unmindful of the foolish crowds upon its banks, flowed on quietly as of yore. The tide ebbed at its usual hour, flowed to its usual height, and then ebbed again, just as if 20 astrologers had not pledged their words to the contrary. Blank were their faces as evening approached, and as blank grew the faces of the citizens to think that they had made such fools of themselves. At last night set in, and the obstinate river would not lift its waters to sweep away even one house out of the 10,000. Still, however, the people were afraid to go to sleep. Many hundreds remained up till dawn of the next day, lest the deluge should come upon them like a thief in the night. On the morrow it was seriously discussed whether it would not be advisable to duck the false prophets in the river. Luckily for them, they thought of an expedient which allayed the popular fury. They asserted that by an error, a very slight one, of a little figure, they had fixed the date of this awful inundation a whole century too early. The stars were right after all, and they, erring mortals, were wrong. The present generation of cockneys was safe, and London would be washed away, not in 1524, but in 1624. At this announcement Bolton the prior dismantled his fortress, and the weary emigrants came back. An eye-witness of the Great Fire of London, in an account preserved among the Harleian manuscripts in the British Museum, and published in the Transactions of the Royal Society of Antiquaries, relates another instance of the credulity of the Londoners. The writer, who accompanied the Duke of York day by day through the district included between the Fleet Bridge and the Thames, states that, in their efforts to check the progress of the flames, they were much impeded by the superstition of the people. Mother Shipton, in one of her prophecies, had said that London would be reduced to ashes, and they refused to make any effort to prevent it. Footnote: This prophecy seems to have been that set forth at length in the popular Life of Mother Shipton. When fate to England shall restore a king to reign as heretofore, great death in London shall be though, and many houses be laid low. End footnote. A son of the noted Sir Kenelm Digby, who was also a pretender to the gifts of prophecy, persuaded them that no power on earth could prevent the fulfilment of the prediction, for it was written in the great book of fate that London was to be destroyed. Hundreds of persons, who might have rendered valuable assistance and saved whole parishes from devastation, folded their arms and looked on. As many more gave themselves up, with the less compunction, to plunder a city which they could not save. Footnote: The London Saturday Journal of March 12, 1842, contains the following: An absurd report is gaining ground among the weak-minded that London will be destroyed by an earthquake on the 17th of March or St. Patrick's Day. This rumour is founded on the following ancient prophecies, one professing to be pronounced in the year 1203, the other by Dr. Dee, the astrologer, in 1598. Quote, In 1842 4 things the sun shall view. London's rich and famous town hungry earth shall swallow down. Storm and rain in France shall be, till every river runs a sea. Spain shall be rent in twain, and famine waste the land again. So say I, the monk of Dree, in the 1200th year and 3. Harleian Collection, British Museum, 800b, folio 319. The Lord have mercy on you all, prepare yourselves for dreadful fall, of house and land and human soul, the measure of your sins is full. In the year 18 and 42, of the year that is so new, in the 3rd month of that 16, it may be a day or two between, perhaps you'll soon be stiff and cold. Dear Christian, be not stout and bold, the mighty, kingly proud will see, this comes to pass as my name's Dee. 1598, manuscript in the British Museum. The alarm of the population of London did not on this occasion extend beyond the wide circle of the uneducated classes, but among them it equalled that recorded in the text. It was soon afterwards stated that no such prophecy is to be found in the Harleian manuscripts. The prophecies of Mother Shipton are still believed in many of the rural districts of England. In cottages and servants' halls her reputation is great, and she rules, the most popular of British prophets, among all the uneducated or half-educated portions of the community. She is generally supposed to have been born at Knaresborough, in the reign of Henry VII, and to have sold her soul to the devil for the power of foretelling future events. Though during her lifetime she was looked upon as a witch, she yet escaped the witch's fate, and died peaceably in her bed at an extreme old age, near Clifton in Yorkshire. A stone is said to have been erected to her memory in the churchyard of that place, with the following epitaph: quoth, "Here lies she who never lied, whose skill often has been tried. Her prophecies shall still survive, and ever keep her name alive." Never a day passed, says her traditionary biography, "wherein she did not relate something remarkable, and that required the most serious consideration. People flocked to her from far and near, her fame was so great. They went to her of all sorts, both old and young, rich and poor, especially young maidens, to be resolved of their doubts relating to things to come, and all returned wonderfully satisfied in the explanations she gave to their questions." Among the rest went the Abbot of Beverley, to whom she foretold the suppression of the monasteries by Henry VIII, his marriage with Anne Boleyn, the fires of heretics in Smithfield, and the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. She also foretold the accession of James I, adding that, with him, "from the cold north every evil should come forth." On a subsequent visit she uttered another prophecy, which, in the opinion of her believers, still remains unfulfilled, but may be expected to be realized during the present century. "The time shall come when seas of blood shall mingle with a greater flood. Great noise there shall be heard, great shouts and cries, and seas shall thunder louder than the skies. Then shall 3 lions fight with 3, and bring joy to a people, honor to a king. That fiery year as soon as over, peace shall then be as before, plenty shall everywhere be found, and men with swords shall plough the ground." But the most famous of all her prophecies is one relating to London. Thousands of persons still shudder to think of the woes that are to burst over this unhappy realm, when London and Highgate are joined by one continuous line of houses. This junction, which, if the rage for building lasts much longer in the same proportion as heretofore, bids fair to be soon accomplished, was predicted by her shortly before her death. Revolutions, the fall of mighty monarchs, and the shedding of much blood are to signalize that event. The very angels, afflicted by our woes, are to turn aside their heads, and weep for hapless Britain. End of Part 1. Part 2. But great as is the fame of Mother Shipton, she ranks but second in the list of British prophets. Merlin, the mighty Merlin, stands alone in his high preeminence, the first and greatest. As old Drayton sings in his Polyolbion, "Of Merlin and his skill what region doth not hear? The world shall still be full of Merlin every year. 1,000 lingering years his prophecies have run, and scarcely shall have end till time itself be done." Spenser, in his divine poem, has given us a powerful description of this renowned seer. who had in magic more insight than ever him before or after living wight. For he by words could call out of the sky both sun and moon and make them him obey, the land to sea and sea to mainland dry, and darksome night he eke could turn to day. Huge hosts of men he could alone dismay, and hosts of men and meanest things could frame, when so him list his enemies to fray, that to this day, for terror of his name, the fiends do quake when any him to them does name. And sooth men say that he was not the son of mortal sire or other living wight, but wondrously begotten and begone by false illusion of a guileful sprite on a fair lady nun." In these verses the poet has preserved the popular belief with regard to Merlin, who is generally supposed to have been a contemporary of Vortigern. Opinion is divided as to whether he were a real personage or a mere impersonation, formed by the poetic fancy of a credulous people. It seems most probable that such a man did exist, and that, possessing knowledge as much above the comprehension of his age as that possessed by Friar Bacon was beyond the reach of his, he was endowed by the wondering crowd with the supernatural attributes that Spenser has enumerated. Geoffrey of Monmouth translated Merlin's poetical odes, or prophecies, into Latin prose, and he was much reverenced not only by Geoffrey, but by most of the old annalists. In A Life of Merlin, with his prophecies and predictions interpreted and made good by our English annals, by Thomas Heywood, published in the reign of Charles I, we find several of these pretended prophecies. They seem, however, to have been all written by Heywood himself. They are in terms too plain and positive to allow any one to doubt for a moment of their having been composed ex post facto. Speaking of Richard I, he says, quote, "The lion's heart will 'gainst the Saracen rise, and purchase from him many a glorious prize. The rose and lily shall at first unite, but parting of the prey prove opposite. But while abroad these great acts shall be done, all things at home shall to disorder run. Cooped up and caged then shall the lion be, but after sufferance ransomed and set free." The simple-minded Thomas Heywood gravely goes on to inform us that all these things actually came to pass. Upon Richard III he is equally luminous. He says, quote, "A hunchbacked monster, who with teeth is born, the mockery of art and nature's scorn, who from the womb preposterously is hurled, and with the feet forward thrust into the world, shall, from the lower earth on which he stood, wade every step he mounts knee-deep in blood. He shall to the height of all his hopes aspire, and, clothed in state, his ugly shape admire. But when he thinks himself most safe to stand, from foreign parts a native whelp shall land." Another of these prophecies after the event tells us that Henry VIII should take the power from Rome, quote, "and bring it home unto his British bower," that he should "root out from the land all the razed skulls," and that he should neither spare "man in his rage nor woman in his lust," and that, in the time of his next successor but one, "there should come in the faggot and the stake." Master Heywood closes Merlin's prophecies at his own day, and does not give even a glimpse of what was to befall England after his decease. Many other prophecies, besides those quoted by him, were, he says, dispersed abroad in his day under the name of Merlin, but he gives his readers a taste of one only, and that is the following. Quote, "When hemp is ripe and ready to pull, then, Englishman, beware thy skull." This prophecy, which, one would think, ought to have put him in mind of the gallows, at that time the not unusual fate of false prophets, he explains thus, quote, "In this word hemp be 5 letters. Now, by reckoning the 5 successive princes from Henry VIII, this prophecy is easily explained. H signifieth King Henry before named. E. Edward his son, the 6th of that name. M. Mary, who succeeded him. P. Philip of Spain, who, by marrying Queen Mary, participated with her in the English diadem. And lastly, E. signifieth Queen Elizabeth, after whose death there was a great fear that some troubles might have arisen about the crown." As this did not happen, Heywood, who was a sly rogue in a small way, gets out of the scrape by saying, Yet proved this augury true, though not according to the former expectation. For, after the peaceful inauguration of King James, there was a great mortality, not in London only, but through the whole kingdom, and from which the nation was not quite clean in 7 years after." This is not unlike the subterfuge of Peter of Pontefract, who had prophesied the death and disposition of King John, and who was hanged by that monarch for his pains. A very graphic and amusing account of this pretended prophet is given by Grafton in his Chronicles of England. "In the meanwhile," says he, "the priests within England had provided them a false and counterfeited prophet, called Peter Wakefield, a Yorkshire man, who was an hermite, an idle gatherer-about, and a prattling merchant. Now to bring this Peter in credit, and the king out of all credit with his people, divers vain persons brooded daily among the commons of the realm, that Christ had twice appeared unto him in the shape of a child between the priest's hands, once at York, another time at Pomfret, and that he had breathed upon him thrice, saying, Peace, 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 and teaching many things, which he anon declared to the bishops, and bid the people amend their naughty living. Being wrapped also in spirit, they said he beheld the joys of heaven and sorrows of hell, for scant were the 3 in the realm, said he, that lived Christianly. This counterfeited soothsayer prophesied of King John that he should reign no longer than the Ascension Day next following, which was in the year of our Lord 1211, and was the 13th year from his coronation, and this, he said, he had by revelation. Then it was of him demanded whether he should be slain or be deposed, or should voluntarily give over the crown. He answered that he could not tell, but of this he was sure, he said, that neither he nor any of his stock or lineage should reign after that day. The king, hearing of this, laughed much at it, and made but a scoff thereat. Tush, saith he, 'tis but an idiot knave, and such a one as lacked his right wits. But when this foolish prophet had so escaped the danger of the king's displeasure, and that he made no more of it, he gaed him abroad, and prated thereof at large, as he was a very idle vagabond, and used to tattle and talk more than enough. So that they which loved the king caused him anon after to be apprehended as a malefactor, and to be thrown in prison, the king not yet knowing thereof. Anon after the fame of this fantastical prophet went all the realm over, and his name was known everywhere, as foolishness is much regarded of the people, where wisdom is not in place, specially because he was then imprisoned for the matter, the rumour was the larger, their wanderings were the wantoner, their practices the foolisher, their busy talks and other idle doings the greater. Continually from thence, as the rude manner of people is, old gossip tales went abroad, new tales were invented, fables were added to fables, and lies grew upon lies, so that every day new slanders were laid upon the king, and not one of them true. Rumours arose, blasphemies were spread, the enemies rejoiced, and treasons by the priests were maintained, and what likewise was surmised, or other subtlety practised, all was then fathered upon this foolish prophet, as thus saith Peter Wakefield, thus hath he prophesied, and thus it shall come to pass. Yea, many times, when he thought nothing less. And when the Ascension Day was come, which was prophesied of before, King John commanded his royal tent to be spread in the open field, passing that day with his noble council and men of honour in the greatest solemnity that ever he did before, solacing himself with musical instruments and songs, most in sight among his trusty friends. When that day was passed in all prosperity and mirth, his enemies being confused, turned all into an allegorical understanding to make the prophecy good, and said, he is no longer king, for the Pope reigned, and not he. King John was labouring under a sentence of excommunication at that time. Then was the king by his council persuaded that this false prophet had troubled the realm, perverted the hearts of the people, and raised the commons against him, for his words went over the sea, by the help of his prelates, and came to the French king's ear, and gave to him a great encouragement to invade the land. He had not else done it so suddenly. But he was most foully deceived, as all they are and shall be that put their trust in such dark drowsy dreams of hypocrites. The king therefore commanded that he should be hanged up, and his son also with him, lest any more false prophets should arise of that race." Heywood, who was a great stickler for the truth of all sorts of prophecies, gives a much more favourable account of this Peter of Pomfret or Pontefract, whose fate he would in all probability have shared if he had had the misfortune to have flourished in the same age. He says that Peter, who was not only a prophet, but a bard, predicted divers of King John's disasters, which fell out accordingly. On being taxed for a lying prophet in having predicted that the king would be deposed before he entered into the 15th year of his reign, he answered him boldly, that all he had said was justifiable and true, for that, having given up his crown to the Pope, and paying him an annual tribute, the Pope reigned, and not he. Heywood thought this explanation to be perfectly satisfactory, and the prophet's faith for ever established. But to return to Merlin. Of him even to this day it may be said, in the words which Burns has applied to another notorious personage, "Great was his power, and great his fame, far kenned and noted his name." His reputation is by no means confined to the land of his birth, but extends through most of the nations of Europe. A very curious volume of his Life, Prophecies, and Miracles, written, it is supposed, by Robert de Bosran, was printed at Paris in 1498, which states that the devil himself was his father, and that he spoke the instant he was born, and assured his mother, a very virtuous young woman, that she should not die in childbed with him, as her ill-natured neighbours had predicted. The judge of the district, hearing of so marvellous an occurrence, summoned both mother and child to appear before him, and they went accordingly the same day. To put the wisdom of the young prophet most effectually to the test, the judge asked him if he knew his own father. To which the infant Merlin replied, in a clear sonorous voice, "Yes, my father is the devil, and I have his power, and know all things, past, present, and to come." His worship clapped his hands in astonishment, and took the prudent resolution of not molesting so awful a child or its mother either. Early tradition attributes the building of Stonehenge to the power of Merlin. It was believed that those mighty stones were whirled through the air, at his command, from Ireland to Salisbury Plain, and that he arranged them in the form in which they now stand, to commemorate for ever the unhappy fate of 300 British chiefs who were massacred on that spot by the Saxons. At Abergwili, near Carmarthen, is still shown the cave of the prophet and the scene of his incantations. How beautiful is the description of it given by Spenser in his Faerie Queene! The lines need no apology for their repetition here, and any sketch of the great prophet of Britain would be incomplete without them. "There the wise Merlin, whilom wont, they say, to make his wonn low underneath the ground, in a deep delve far from the view of day, that of no living wight he mot be found, went so he counselled with his sprites encompassed round. And if thou ever happen that same way to travel, go to see that dreadful place. It is a hideous hollow cave, they say, under a rock that lies a little space from the swift Barry, tumbling down apace amongst the woody hills of Denver. But dare thou not, I charge, in any case, to enter into that same baleful bower, for fear the cruel fiends should thee unwares devour. But, standing high aloft, low lay thine ear, and there such ghastly noise of iron chains and brazen cauldrons thou shalt rumbling hear, which 1,000 sprites with long enduring pains do toss, that it will stun thy feeble brains. And oftentimes great groans and grievous stounds, when too huge toil and labour them constrains, and oftentimes loud strokes and ringing sounds, from under that deep rock most horribly rebounds. The cause, they say, is this: a little while before that Merlin died, he did intend a brazen wall in compass to compile about Caer Murden, and did it command unto these sprites to bring to perfect end, during which work the Lady of the Lake, whom long he loved, for him in haste did send, who thereby forced his workmen to forsake, them bound till his return their labour not to slake. In the meantime, through that false lady's train he was surprised and buried under byre, nor ever to his work returned again. Nevertheless these fiends may not their work forbear, so greatly his commandment they fear, but there do toil and travel day and night, until that brazen wall they up do rear." Faerie Queene, Book 3, Chapter 3, Section 6-13. Amongst other English prophets, a belief in whose power has not been entirely effaced by the light of advancing knowledge, is Robert Nixon, the Cheshire idiot, a contemporary of Mother Shipton. The popular accounts of this man say that he was born of poor parents not far from Vale Royal, on the edge of the forest of Delamere.
He was brought up to the plough, but was so ignorant and stupid that nothing could be made of him. Everybody thought him irretrievably insane, and paid no attention to the strange, unconnected discourses which he held. Many of his prophecies are believed to have been lost in this manner. But they were not always destined to be wasted upon dull and inattentive ears. An incident occurred which brought him into notice and established his fame as a prophet of the first calibre. He was ploughing in a field when he suddenly stopped from his labour, and with a wild look and strange gesture exclaimed, "Now, Dick! Now, Harry! Oh, ill done, Dick! Oh, well done, Harry! Harry was gained the day!" His fellow labourers in the field did not know what to make of this rhapsody, but the next day cleared up the mystery. News was brought by a messenger, in hot haste, that at the very instant when Nixon had thus ejaculated, Richard III had been slain at the Battle of Bosworth, and Henry VII proclaimed King of England. It was not long before the fame of the new prophet reached the ears of the king, who expressed a wish to see and converse with him. A messenger was accordingly dispatched to bring him to court, but long before he reached Cheshire, Nixon knew and dreaded the honours that awaited him. Indeed, it was said that at the very instant the king expressed the wish, Nixon was, by supernatural means, made acquainted with it, and that he ran about the town of Over in great distress of mind, calling out, like a madman, that Henry had sent for him, and that he must go to court, and be clammed, that is, starved to death. These expressions excited no little wonder, but on the third day the messenger arrived and carried him to court, leaving on the minds of the good people of Cheshire an impression that their prophet was one of the greatest ever born. On his arrival, King Henry appeared to be troubled exceedingly at the loss of a valuable diamond, and asked Nixon if he could inform him where it was to be found. Henry had hidden the diamond himself with a view to test the prophet's skill. Great, therefore, was his surprise when Nixon answered him in the words of the old proverb, "Those who hide can find." From that time forth the king implicitly believed that he had the gift of prophecy, and ordered all his words to be taken down. During all the time of his residence at court he was in constant fear of being starved to death, and repeatedly told the king that such would be his fate if he were not allowed to depart and return into his own country. Henry would not suffer it, but gave strict orders to all his officers and cooks to give him as much to eat as he wanted. He lived so well that for some time he seemed to be thriving like a nobleman's steward, and growing as fat as an alderman. One day the king went out hunting, when Nixon ran to the palace gate and entreated on his knees that he might not be left behind to be starved. The king laughed, and, calling an officer, told him to take especial care of the prophet during his absence, and rode away to the forest. After his departure, the servants of the palace began to jeer at and insult Nixon, whom they imagined to be much better treated than he deserved. Nixon complained to the officer, who, to prevent him from being further molested, locked him up in the king's own closet, and brought him regularly his 4 meals a day. But it so happened that the messenger arrived from the king to this officer, requiring his immediate presence at Winchester on a matter of life and death. So great was his haste to obey the king's command that he mounted on the horse behind the messenger and rode off, without bestowing a thought upon poor Nixon. He did not return till 3 days afterwards, when, remembering the prophet for the first time, he went to the king's closet and found him lying upon the floor, starved to death, as he had predicted. Among the prophecies of his, which are believed to have been fulfilled, are the following, which relate to the times of the Pretender. Quote, "A great man shall come into England, but the son of a king shall take from him the victory." Quote, "Crows shall drink the blood of many nobles, and the north shall rise against the south." Quote, "The cock of the north shall be made to flee, and his feather be plucked for his pride, that he shall almost curse the day that he was born." All these, say his admirers, are as clear as the sun at noonday. The first denotes the defeat of Prince Charles Edward at the Battle of Culloden by the Duke of Cumberland; the second, the execution of Lords Derwentwater, Balmerino, and Lovat; and the third, the retreat of the Pretender from the shores of Britain. Among the prophecies that still remain to be accomplished are the following: Quote, "Between 7, 8, and 9, in England wonders shall be seen; between 9 and 13, all sorrow shall be done." Quote, "Through our own money and our men shall a dreadful war begin; between the sickle and the suck, all England shall have a pluck." Quote, Foreign nations shall invade England with snow on their helmets, and shall bring plague, famine, and murder in the skirts of their garments." "The town of Nantwich shall be swept away by a flood." Of the two first of these no explanation has yet been attempted, but some event or other will doubtless be twisted into such a shape as will fit them. The third, relative to the invasion of England by a nation with snow on their helmets, is supposed by the old women to foretell most clearly a coming war with Russia. As to the last, there are not a few in the town mentioned who devoutly believe that such will be its fate. Happily for their peace of mind, the prophet said nothing of the year that was to witness the awful calamity, so that they think it as likely to be 2 centuries hence as now. The popular biographers of Nixon conclude their account of him by saying that "his prophecies are by some persons thought fables, yet by what has come to pass it is now thought, and very plainly appears, that most of them have proved or will prove true; for which we on all occasions ought not only to exert our utmost might to repel by force our enemies, but to refrain from our abandoned and wicked course of life, and to make our continual prayer to God for protection and safety." To this, though a non sequitur, every one will cry Amen. Besides the prophets, there have been the almanac makers Lilly, Poor Robin, Partridge, and Francis Moore physician, in England, and Matthew Landsberg, in France and Belgium. But great as were their pretensions, they were modesty itself in comparison with Merlin, Shipton, and Nixon, who fixed their minds upon higher things than the weather, and were not so restrained as to prophesy for only 1 year at a time. After such prophets the almanac makers hardly deserve to be mentioned; not even the renowned Partridge, whose prognostications set all England agog in 1708, and whose death while still alive was so pleasantly and satisfactorily proved by Isaac Bickerstaff. The anticlimax would be too palpable, and they and their doings must be left uncommemorated.
End of Modern Prophecies by Charles Mackay.